You're listening to 94.4 FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show.
You're listening to Salford City Radio, 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show. Your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you news from the local area and around the world. We're very fortunate in this show to have some of the world's best athletes, sports people, coaches, trainers, people who work in a variety of different disciplines in sport, psychologists. We also have a segment featuring some of the world's most influential people in the field of psychology and related fields. The aim of the show is to increase awareness and participation of different sports. At the moment, we've sort of been featuring rowing, which is a sport that GB has a proud history in and no doubt has got a promising future in. So today we have a very special guest who is a Team GB rower, Josh Bugajski. Welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Great to be here, Jim.
No, it's great for you to join us, Josh. I suppose we sort of always start in the beginning in terms of how you got into rowing. Our listeners are probably sort of curious to sort of know how did you sort of get into rowing?
Well, I didn't get into it until much later on. I was actually 20 by the time I took it up. I was at uni down in Cardiff, and a friend of mine from back home had gone off elsewhere, and he'd met a guy who rowed, and kind of through meeting him, he kind of gave me a bit of advice, saying that because I was like really tall and I used to play loads of sports, I was already pretty fit and strong, so he said like I should give it a go. So Brilliant. Signed up to Cardiff Uni rowing, and it kind of went from there really.
No, that's really interesting, and it seems to be a theme with a lot of roles I've spoken to, Josh, where there's like a talent ID, I suppose, if we want to call it that, but like yourself, getting in at 20, and how influential is that to have that opportunity? Obviously, a lot of talent out there like yourself, but I think it's really important that sort of continues, because obviously people like yourself who play sport, or even I've spoken to people who don't necessarily play sport, have got the ability. Do you see that as being important to sort of keep giving people the opportunity to demonstrate their ability?
Yeah, definitely. I think kind of putting it out there, making sure there is like plenty of availability of that opportunity in all kind of different parts of the country, so that people have can just kind of like rock up and give it a go and find out whether they might be talented in the sport or whether they might enjoy the sport, even if they don't have kind of prospects of getting to the top. And then I think also kind of having the support then to go forward, because I think when I was younger I did loads of different sports, but it was always kind of basically me and my brother used to just play against each other and everything.
Yeah.
We probably got pretty good at quite a few things, and kind of I played football for a team for a little bit and stuff, but in a lot of the stuff I was trying, I didn't really have the support to kind of go much further in it, whereas when I kind of ended up in rowing, once I'd kind of been talent ID'd, the structure was kind of put forward for me to be able to kind of progress in the sport. I think that was kind of what was key to then me kind of stepping up to where I am now.
That's interesting, and what I find interesting is one of the things that sort of intrigues me is with athletes is at what point did you feel, Josh, that you could perform on the world stage? I mean, obviously, 20 years of age, you're in there, and a lot of athletes obviously start, various sports, possibly as young as 5, 6, even, through their teens. But at 20, at what point do you think, what, I can compete against the world's best? I've got something here.
Well, it was, the progress definitely wasn't linear. I mean, I had all the physical requirements to be a good rower from very early on in it, but for my first year when I was rowing, I was pretty rubbish on the water, if I'm honest. I used to spend more time falling in than kind of going anywhere fast. Oddly enough, it was I took a summer break from it the following year and then came back, and suddenly it all kind of just clicked. And about 9 months after that, I ended up rowing for GB in the under-23 World Championships. So I think it was at that point when I kind of stepped up suddenly to that level that I was kind of, that was at the same time, I was in 2012, so the Olympics was going on at the same time in London, and suddenly there was this kind of like, I could see that my athletic ability and my times on the water were suddenly kind of going up in a direction that was kind of putting me towards that end of the spectrum, albeit it then ended up taking another 8 years 9 years as it is now before I've ended up reaching it.
Wow, that's really interesting stuff. And you know what sort of probably intrigued the listeners as well in terms of, you mentioned like the ID, the talent ID. Obviously, physiologically, you mentioned there, you know, your height, your strength. But is it okay to sort of give us a bit of an insight in terms of what, you know, no doubt you've got to be able to translate that into rowing. And is there sort of any sort of criteria you can share with us in terms of what they're looking for? Is there like a time that you can do on the rower, or just general technique? What I know is probably outside, you know, your remit to a certain degree, but what were they looking at, Josh, in terms of to see if you could be a rower?
Well, I think initially they kind of look for kind of like athletic ability. So a lot of it can be around like power output. I mean, you don't need to be able to like know the technique on the rowing machine to start off with. That can be taught quite fast at a later date. But kind of like, I mean, if you're going to do long stuff on the rowing machine, it's good to have technique kind of down so you don't end up injuring yourself, and it just makes it a lot easier over the longer distances because you're a lot more efficient. But over short distances, you can test people out even if they haven't really done it much before. So, like when I first went to Cardiff Uni, the first thing I did was we did a 1 kilometre test, and you were limited to taking 24 strokes every minute. So it's a lot lower stroke rate than I raced at now, which is more like 40 strokes per minute. And yeah, so I think my first time was 3 minutes and 7 seconds off the top of my head.
Wow.
That was 6th of October 2010, so the day after my 20th birthday. So
for 1K, Josh, was that for a 1K row? Was that, or?
Yeah, so that's a 1K row at rate 24.
Wow.
Yeah. So 24 strokes. So you're pulling the handle 24 times every minute, and it's on the little screen on the rowing machine, it'll say.
Yeah. No, I'm just interested because in that, because one area I've worked in is in football from a mental skills, but also physical preparation, and I've always used rowing machines and jokingly said to the players that we'd set up little rowing competitions, and I'd say, well, if football doesn't work out, maybe we'll sort of rowing, or that's, obviously rowing's a great sport type thing, and in that respect. But it's really interesting you say that the time wise it's incredible. What I used to set them is like targets over a minute to try and get as fast as they could, and a 2K row, but obviously the technique and was a little bit all over the place. But it's really interesting you say the sort of the strokes per minute and the time wise, and it's quite an interesting thing. But in terms of fitness in general, the rowing machines for me, I think, is a great thing because it's like non-impact as well. It has a lot of benefits in terms of, I suppose we look at rowing and think the strength is in the arms, but it's a whole body technique. Josh, is that the case where you've got to really coordinate your movement?
Yeah, I mean, so you need, it's actually very leg dominant.
Yeah.
But you then, because you're transferring the power from your legs to the handle, you need to have a strong core, so strong abs and all that kind of stuff, and strong shoulders to stabilize. And then there is a little bit of arm involvement, but it's not as much as most people think. But yeah, I found this out last year because last year before what would have been the on schedule Tokyo 2020 selection, a nerve in my shoulder broke. We're still kind of at a loss as to how on earth it happened. It was a very weird and rare injury to have. And I spent from about February until almost September almost purely training on a bike, just to keep my fitness. So my legs stayed really strong, my fitness stayed really high. But then when it came to transferring back onto the rowing machine, I realised how much of the strength in my core and my shoulders and the rest of my body had disappeared. Suddenly I couldn't connect the strength in my legs to the handle. So it took me a good kind of couple more months to be able to kind of fully kind of get back into the groove of it again.
Yeah, and absolutely. That's really interesting you say, and definitely I think, like from what you said there, anyone sort of contemplating getting into it, even recreationally, technique is obviously important from even the physical side of things as well. And in terms of our listeners, no doubt plenty of many of them may have used the rowing machine in the gym and that sort of stuff, and been given instructions in how to use the rowing machine. But that's what I find interesting too, Josh. So, for example, the technique, is it sort of tailored to you, the technique? I mean, generally if someone goes in the gym and there's a rowing machine, goes on the rowing machine, the instructor will sort of give them an idea what to do in terms of the back straight and so on and so forth. But do you guys have like a tailored technique for your own physiology and that sort of stuff, or is it just generally one sort of technique you aim to aspire to?
Well, once when we're in boats together, because if you're in a single scull on your own, or if you're on the rowing machine, you can kind of the rhythm and the timings of what you do can be a little bit more individualized. And I mean, if you could go into deep dive into the physics and mechanics behind the rowing stroke, and there are different nations around the country that slightly change how they time different parts of a stroke. But I'm sure that's for when you're kind of trying to get to a world-class level. But the very basics, I mean, if you're trying to row in boats together, the main thing you're aspiring to do is just row in the same way at the same time. Anything that's not in time with each other usually kind of detracts from the boat speed and actually makes it, if two people are trying to move in two different directions at the same time, it just means that you both end up expending more energy to do the movement. So the ideal is you're just moving in the same way at the same time. So yeah, you need to kind of find an agreed kind of technique and timing. But for the basic stuff on the rowing machine, I mean, there's loads of like if you go on Instagram or YouTube or whatever, there's loads of like indoor rowing coaches now there's plenty of content out there, and if there is anyone that's kind of interested in picking it up, you can easily find some of the kind of like the basic advice how to get going.
Absolutely. And in terms of yourself, your highlights, Josh, what would you say your highlights have been so far? I know that there's many more to come, but what would you say the highlights of your career have been thus far?
Well, I did the Oxford Cambridge boat race in 2016 and 2017. 2016 we lost, and that's coming second in a 2-horse race is not fun. But to come back and win it in 2017, it's an incredibly big event. I know it's not the same kind of standard as, I mean, I've been to World Cups and I've been to World Championships now, but I'd still say as an event that I've been to so far or raced in, the boat race was the most well covered and like with the biggest crowds I'd ever been to, and the feeling of winning that race was something I still haven't quite recreated yet. But there's like Henley Royal Regatta, which I guess would be like the rowing equivalent of like going to Ascot or something like that. That, I mean, racing in that's really good, really fun, because like the crowds are right on top of you because it's a much smaller river. And yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to the Olympics, albeit it is going to be a weird one. It's going to be much quieter than normal. I think I've seen the most recent guidelines of that the crowds won't be allowed to kind of shout and cheer and make loud noises, basically, as part of the COVID restrictions. So it might be a bit ominous, kind of rowing along with a bunch of silent people watching you. Yeah,
one thing's for sure. I'm sure you'll have plenty of people, back in the UK and GB shouting at the TV. That's for sure. In that respect, willing you on. And in terms of yourself, going forward, what would you say your main aspirations are, Josh? Obviously, GB's got a strong tradition of doing well in rowing for many, many years, and I'm sure it will for a long time to come on. But what are your sort of aspirations going forward as a rower?
Well, in the immediate short term, it's to get a gold medal. We've put ourselves in an incredibly good position to do it. Although we're well aware that we're up against some very, very strong competition, New Zealand and Germany and the Dutch and so on and so forth. But I mean, beyond Tokyo, I need to have a little bit of a rest. I've barely really taken a holiday in the last 11 years. So a bit of time to do that. I've got a new fiance. Recently became engaged to my fiance, so I think we need a holiday together at some point. But I do have, so I've got some projects that I'll be working on. British Rowing have their charitable arm called Love Rowing, so I'm getting involved with them to help with setting up kind of more like community similar to what we were talking about before, to kind of give more opportunities for people to kind of to discover rowing, and then if they enjoy it, to kind of try and start finding the pathway so that they can kind of continue in the sport.
Absolutely.
And my aspirations are to kind of help people from my, because my background, although I sit in the boat and you wouldn't really pick me out from the rest of the guys in it, my background is quite different from that kind of like traditional to rowing. Rowing is traditionally seen as quite a public school sport, kind of a very wealthy sport, and that's not my background at all. So I'm very keen for people who consider themselves as like normal people, or working class or whatever, to kind of know that actually there will be routes to get into the sport, and that the sport isn't it's not aloof, it's not something that can't be attained.
No, it's interesting stuff, and I mean, I'm sort of opposite where they do rowing, and a lake, Hollingworth Lake, they got rowing, and sometimes I'll go for a walk around and just sort of see the rowers on a summer evening or any time of year really, and I think, wow, all levels really are out there, and absolutely, I think it's great that you're doing that, Josh, and I'm sure that there's plenty of areas around the UK, around GB, where given the opportunity, who knows how far someone can go. But I suppose equally as important is participation is a big thing. But what's it like in terms of setting your mind to the Olympics? I can imagine that it's sort of obviously getting closer now. How does it feel, sort of, Josh, to sort of the reality of the Olympics?
It's really hard, because the thing is we spend so much time training, and we're training so hard all the time that you kind of, it's hard to go and remember that we're building into something. You kind of just get completely bogged down in how much we're training and how hard we're going. I think for me it was actually when we had the official selection, and which was June the 7th, I think, off the top of my head. We got to try on some of the kit. It was only when we started trying on the kit, and I think over the years it starts taking more and more for me to get excited about stuff. But when I tried to try on the kit, I suddenly felt like a little kid again, where I was like, kind of, wow, am I actually kind of going to be doing this? It's kind of, you could start kind of envisioning what it was going to look like going there, and kind of, you could imagine, I don't know, you can start to kind of mentally prepare. You can start visualizing what the race will look like, because you can suddenly imagine what the person in front of you is going to be wearing, and you can start, as the other teams announce their kit, you can almost envision like their kit on them in the boats next to you as you're racing them, and so it's the excitement is starting to set in. We are in a training camp at the moment at altitude, so I'm actually sat in Austria at the moment, 2,000 meters up a mountain. So we're in the middle of one of our toughest training camps of the year, and
wow,
I think this is really it's taken the edge off the excitement when you have to put yourself in a hole every day. But we're back in the UK next week with loads of COVID restrictions in place. We'll be back for 8 days, but we won't be going home, and we won't be seeing any loved ones. It will just be in our bubble, and then we fly out to Tokyo.
Yeah, no, that's interesting stuff. And in terms of you mentioned sort of mental preparation, obviously without giving any sort of secrets away, I know that you've got your sort of training you do, but can you give us a bit of insight in terms of what sort of mental preparation you do, Josh? How you sort of generally prepare yourself mentally for the events, and sort of, going into an Olympics, and you've sort of set the bar at sort of gold, and what sort of mental preparation can you sort of share with our listeners that you do?
Well, I guess a lot of it's very individual to a lot of the different guys in the team, and we do kind of speak with team psychologists to kind of get the best advice on what we do. I mean, for me personally, before I race, I've usually probably visualized doing the race hundreds, if not thousands of times, and I'm imagining being in different scenarios. Are we leading the race from the start? Are we losing the race at the start and have to kind of build through? Each visualization ends up in a win. There are no aspirations to come anything other than that, but I'm covering all the different scenarios in my head, and I think you spoke with one of my colleagues, Jess Layden, last week, one of my teammates, and in rowing it is quite bizarre in that because we're going backwards, it means that if you have someone you, it can be quite a psychologically very tough, because you're chasing down someone that you can't see anymore. So the target disappears. So I think that's one of the kind of unique aspects of rowing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's
but in terms of, there's also kind of, for me personally, I took some advice from a coach quite a long time ago. He said, if I ask you to jump in the air as high as you can, you'll probably jump 99% of how high you can jump, because we all know how to jump, and we can just do it on the spot, really. And then he said, like, if I told you to kind of like think about like just like really gee yourself up for it, like think about everything that's kind of gone before, all the training you've done, and then do it again, you might be able to eke out an extra 0.1% or something. My aspiration with rowing is to be able to know that, because of all the training I've done and how well prepared my body is and how many times I've already rehearsed the races, that I don't need to rely too much on I try not to take as much of the psychological component out of it as I can, and kind of basically treat the race as someone's telling me to jump in the air. If they asked me to do it tomorrow, I could do it. If they asked me to do it in a week, I could do it. So
absolutely.
For me, I know other guys are very different, but for me, that's been one of the things that I've always had in my head, just kind of like trust that my body does what it needs to do. So when I am in that part of the race, when it's really hurting, I can almost take the psychological component out and go, right, I know my body can do this. It's done it before, like hundreds of times in training. I'll just do it again and just trust that it will.
That's really interesting stuff. So you sort of, it seems to me that you sort of really, you focus on the sort of process, and I suppose for our listeners who sort of may never get opportunity, or many of us won't get opportunity to sort of compete at that sort of level. What's it like when you're competing at that level where the margins are literally so fine? Josh, just a bit of an insight into our listeners. You've mentioned there, obviously, you back yourself, and you've got obviously ability to go with that. But what's it like when you're you're sort of aware of that in terms of the margins being so fine, and what's the experience like? What's the feeling like when you're when you're in a situation where the margins are really, really fine?
I mean, it makes life very difficult, because sometimes you can have a race where you feel like you've nailed everything, and in your head you're thinking, wow, we should be kind of miles ahead of anyone, because we've absolutely stuck with our plan. The boat's going really well, and then we're in an age that we have a cox in the boat, and he'll say, oh, we're level with the Germans or something like that. So suddenly you realise, oh, we've done all that, and they're right next to us. They haven't moved anywhere. They're going at it. And actually, this happened a few weeks ago when we went to Lucerne for the World Cup 2. We ended up winning in the final by 0.02 of a second.
Wow.
Or 0.3, one or the other. It was less than the distance, about a finger length between winning and losing that race.
Incredible.
And it is nerve-wracking. It's just exciting, really. If I'm honest, it's like going through those kind of races. It just kind of, the adrenaline does get going, and you, especially when it comes to the final sprint, you kind of, I don't know, you just have to throw everything at it, and you just have to kind of use that excitement. I mean, it's always a lot nicer to win a race when you kind of dominate it from the start, and you can kind of go and win by miles. But I mean, the advantage of kind of those close races is that the excitement you're left with afterwards, and the memories you're left with afterwards, are so much more than the boring row-overs.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really powerful, Josh. I'm sort of really grateful for you to join us on the show. You've given us some really interesting insights, and no doubt you'll inspire many people. Obviously, you guys are an inspiration, and no doubt there'll be youngsters sort of watching and tuning in, and decide to sort of take it up themselves. So, but it's been really fascinating. So, I really want to thank you, Josh. We wish you all the best at the Olympics.
And anyone who wants to take it up, I mean, you've got Agecroft Rowing Club in Salford, or you've got Trafford if you're in more like South Manchester.
Brilliant.
These are places that people can head down and try the sport out.
Brilliant. That's kind of you to sort of share that, Josh. No doubt there are youngsters interested in taking that up, but we'll certainly keep an eye out to see how you get on, and we wish you all the best, and thank you for coming aboard the Friday Sports Show. Thanks, Josh.
Oh, thank you very much. Yep. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, Josh Bugajski, who is a GB rower, who's been very kind to join us on the Friday Sports Show, Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, giving us insight into his career and his aspirations on the Friday Sports Show.